Happy Saturday. It's September 7th, 2024, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in London.
And I'm Michael Haney in New York City.
Lots of intriguing news this week. In the UK, it wasn't all about the Oasis tour and our collective angst over the ticketing process. Sir Keir Starmer's new Labour government has announced plans to fast-track the end of hereditary peerages in the House of Lords. What does this mean for Baroness Bra, our favourite? Time shall tell. Meanwhile, in France, Michel Barnier, the former EU commissioner who negotiated the Brexit deal, is the new prime minister. Gabrielle Attal, we hardly knew ye. And most enticingly, investigative journalists in Russia have identified Vladimir Putin's two young sons with his lover, the former rhythmic gymnast Alina Kabaeva. Ivan is 9, Vladimir Jr. is 5. They live in a mansion with all sorts of tutors and other household staff members, and allegedly, at least one of them is a major Disney fan. Just one of the fun ways he can earn his father's disapproval. And on that note, Michael, let's get to the good stuff, the new issue of Airmail.
Yeah, and we've got a wonderful show today with some fascinating guests and wonderful conversations. First, the acclaimed journalist Mark Seal is going to join us to discuss his riveting news story for Airmail. This week, we're publishing the first part in a multi-part series in which Mark looks at a murder that shocked the seemingly unshakable state of Florida. It's a case where a millionaire real estate developer named Sergio Pino allegedly poisoned his wife of 32 years when she demanded a divorce. Then, Bruce Handy will tell us all about the most ill-advised I Love Lucy-like sitcom in television history that was canceled after a single episode. It was called, wait for it, Heil Honey, I'm Home, and it was a domestic comedy about, yes, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. You'll have to hear this one to believe it. And finally, do you know about the Vogue curse? For decades, brides around the world have fought to get their weddings covered in Vogue magazine. But in doing so, are they actually dooming their marriage to a divorce? Paulina Prosnitz and Carolina de Armas, two of our editors here at Airmail, have looked into these unions and will join us to take you inside the Vogue curse. It's a story you don't want to miss. So Ashley, where would you like to begin today?
So why don't we start with Mark Seal and this really bizarre story out of Coral Gables, Florida. For decades, Sergio Pino and his wife Tatiana looked like they were living the American dream. Not only was it a fairy tale love story, but they had also made an awful lot of money in the world of construction and real estate development. But then it all went wrong. And some people have called Florida a sunny state for shady people. And Mark Seal is here with some evidence to support that conceit. Mark Seal is a special correspondent for Vanity Fair and the author of many nonfiction books, including The Man in the Rockefeller Suit. And my favorite, Leave the Gun, Take the Cannoli, all about The Godfather. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Mark, before we get into the incredibly dramatic and difficult marriage between Sergio Pino and his wife, Tatiana, take us to the community of Coral Gables, Florida, where they live. What is it like there?
It's amazing. I'd been to Miami quite a bit in the past, and Coral Gables is this community, a suburb actually, 5 miles from Miami, and you feel like you're in the tropics. The couple days I was there was a torrential rainstorm, so hard that I had to pull off the road. And then I rode by the area where the Pinos lived, which was a gated community called Coco Plum. And there were these banyan trees hanging down like you would see in Hawaii or whatever, with their huge roots and branches. And it would almost shade the street like a canopy or an umbrella. So, I could just imagine this world that's kind of separate, but also, part of Miami, but 45,000 people is pretty small town.
And, this is a very wealthy community, it should be said, which brings us to one of our main characters. I mean, Sergio Pino is, as you write, a businessman, a developer, but in many ways, he's also emblematic of the American dream.
Exactly. He came to Miami from Cuba with his parents when he was, 12 years old. They moved into an efficiency apartment. And he began, working, actually, it said, doing plumbing and cleaning. In one account, it said he cleaned welcome mats for hotels, for a hotel or hotels or something like that. So he started with very humble beginnings. He bought a small plumbing supply shop in Miami, but he renamed it eventually Century, and I thought kind of that was like expressing his ambitions, to become somebody. And he became the head of the largest, it said it was the largest, but it was at least one of the largest Hispanic-owned home building companies in America.
And Mark, it's been reported and it's been alleged that he built this empire with the assistance of his wife, Tatiana. So we know he was married briefly and was divorced when he was 29 and had 2 children with his first wife. But how did he encounter Tatiana? What was she like? And tell us a little bit about what we know of the early days of their marriage.
Yeah, so they met. The story goes, there was a very early Miami Herald story about Sergio, and it told the story of him as a young man. I think he was 29 and she was 17 or 18. And he walked into this grocery that was 2 blocks from his office back then. And he saw her and she was behind the cash register. She's a very religious woman, but apparently they fell in love. And, he whisked her off into this world of, he was a very wealthy man by then. He was, already a home builder. And he was doing well. He owned land. He had really good income. And so that's how they met and fell in love. So it started off like a fairy tale, right?
Well, yeah. And then all of a sudden something went wrong. So when did we start to see some fractures in the marriage?
The investigation began in July of 2022, and they had been estranged, and she filed for divorce that year, I believe. So apparently, before that, she had been stricken with what is believed to be poisoning anyway. And she had, fits where she had to go to the hospital and was showing these really serious, scary symptoms. And so that's how it all began. And it kind of spiraled on from there into this unbelievably wild. And I've covered a lot of crime cases, but this one was just almost unbelievable in its scope, in the things that happened, there were 9 different men that were allegedly hired or enlisted to do all of these things. It just spiraled into this amazingly crazy case.
And we can trace some of the discontent and discord in their marriage right back to an alleged affair that Sergio Pino had with a real estate broker, right? Was that kind of the beginning of when things started to go wrong, as far as we can tell?
I think that was part of it. I believe there were other aspects, but that was definitely for sure part of it. And they separated after, she was living, I think they were living together when she started showing these symptoms of, having to go to the hospital and all of these illnesses. And then she went to a hospital where they allegedly discovered fentanyl in her blood system. And so then she moved out because she said, definitely, I wasn't taking fentanyl. So she moved out, she filed for divorce, and that's when things really got intense.
Well, what do we know about their sort of prenuptial agreements? Like, why wasn't it enough for Sergio just to divorce her? Why do we think that he started poisoning her? Why do we feel like she had to die?
Well, I think there was a post-nuptial agreement after they were married. They were married in a civil ceremony back in the early 90s, maybe 1992. So then before a religious ceremony that they had with all of their friends, I think it was 300 people or something, he gave her another, according to the legal documents, he gave her another post-nuptial agreement that she said surprised her. He said otherwise. It was where she wouldn't get alimony, and there were all of these other restrictions. And so there was a big differing over that, who would get what in the divorce. And the divorce dragged on for a couple of years because it started, in 2022, I believe, and now it's 2024. So, and the docket sheet, I think there's just hundreds, if not 1,000 different exhibits. So it was really a contentious divorce.
Mark, I know your story's in 2 parts, and we don't want to go too much into, you sort of leave us with a cliffhanger, but
yes,
we should definitely talk about the Friendsgiving experience of 2019, because this was quite a bizarre scenario in which Tatiana was a guest at the home of Christian podcaster Lisa Lorenzo in Miami, and there were all sorts of impressive people there. Tell us a little bit about that night.
Yeah, so it was a Friendsgiving event. And it was maybe 40 women, and everybody brought a covered dish, and it was to celebrate the coming Thanksgiving holiday. And, all of a sudden, one of the guests told me she took one bite of something. There was all this food on a buffet. She took one bite of something and became so ill, she had to rush to the bathroom where she threw up. And pretty soon she looked around the room and other people were, as she said, dropping like flies. A lot of these women, and some of them were very influential women in the community, got so ill they had to be taken to the hospital in ambulances, which soon lined this privileged street with their, lights turning and sirens blaring. And she said that once she got into the ambulance, the EMT said, could you sit up? Because we had to put someone else in the ambulance. And it turned out to be Mrs. Pino. And she was even too ill to speak. And so the headlines about this and other events were filled the Miami Herald front pages for, day after day after day. And I kept thinking about that line by Carl Hiaasen, the Florida novelist, where he said, every time he writes the sickest thing he could ever imagine, something comes along to surpass it in real life. And I thought, if ever there was a case, this is the one. And as soon as I read about this case, I caught the first thing smoking, as we say in the South, to Miami to see what was going on, because I just thought, wow, there has to be, it was just so much to it, it just had so many, first of all, incredible characters on both sides of the law. So it exceeded my expectations, to say the least.
So, Mark, amazingly, she has survived all of this, even getting a pacemaker inserted, as you know, because doctors don't know what's going on. So has the trial concluded?
No, the divorce was ongoing.
Right.
And so that was one of the caveats that, that allegedly there was a wiretap or there was something in one of the documents that, that this had to be concluded before the next divorce hearing, and that was coming up in July, I believe. And I believe he got a delay on that. But, there was a timeline. There was a ticking clock on this.
And I should just say, by ticking clock on this, I just want to clarify for listeners that this is Pinot's alleged clock to have his wife expire, as it were, before the trial and before he could conceivably lose his assets. He was a desperate man, allegedly.
And these attempts against her kept, escalating and multiplying. And so there was something of a deadline to this, and she survived it all, which is pretty incredible in itself. And then something else happens that I want to leave for the ending of the story that makes it just almost cinematic, and Shakespearean and everything else you can think of all at once that happens in the end.
We're going to leave our listeners hanging on the cliff and encourage them all to read this week's installment and the follow-up that you've got coming, and without spoiling it, and we'll leave you there wanting more, because it's a story that even Carl Hiaasen would be blown away by.
Exactly. I kept thinking about all of that, about his work, and think about all the books that he's done and the stories that he's done from Florida. So this is his territory for sure.
Yeah, but no one tells it quite like you, Mark. Thank you so much for it.
Thank you, too.
Michael, once again, I'm already casting this film in my head.
Yeah, it's got film or multi-part television series written all over it.
Paging Ryan Murphy.
Paging Ryan Murphy. On the note of television, Ashley, and film, we talk about peak TV. There's a story Bruce Handy that has this week, which might call cratered TV. Maybe the lowest of an idea that anyone could bring on TV.
Tell me more.
Well, it's a story out of that happened in the UK back in the 60s when, it's not all that surprising. There was a show here in the US called Hogan's Heroes, which is about American POWs in a German-run prisoner of war camp in World War II. And then this one was about some people who thought, what if you did a domestic comedy involving Adolf Hitler? It really happened. And Bruce Handy unearthed the sort of story behind a series that, didn't even make it to a series, a show that only lasted one episode on British television.
Bruce Handy is a journalist and the author of Wild Things, The Joy of Reading Children's Literature as an Adult. Welcome, Bruce Handy.
How are you guys? Thanks for having me.
So, Bruce, I feel like kind of un-PC just even giving the title of the most ill-advised sitcom in television history, but it's called, ready? Heil, Honey, I'm Home. How did you first get word of this bizarre phenomenon?
Well, I wish I could claim it. Honestly, Braden Carter wrote to me and asked me if I wanted to write about it. And it was something I had never actually heard of before. And of course, I was intrigued, pretty much immediately said yes. And certainly after I went on YouTube, where the pilot episode, which is the only episode that ever actually aired, although they ultimately filmed, it's not clear exactly. Nobody seems to remember. I think they filmed a total of 7 or 8 episodes total. But anyways, the pilot you can go see exists on YouTube. And I watched that. And yeah, I was immediately hooked. It's a funny thing. It's not a good show. The premise is it's a 1950s style sitcom in the manner of I Love Lucy or The Honeymooners, a domestic sitcom where the central couple are Adolf and Ava and their two next door neighbors, like all of the Mertzes, or the couple in the next door neighbors in The Honeymooners. The couple are a Jewish couple named Arnie and Rosa Goldenstein. The premise is the premise, but you watch the thing and you can see that it's talented people. The actors are good. The direction is good. They really capture, except for the fact that it's filmed in color instead of black and white. It just totally has the feel of a sitcom, a 1950s sitcom, or maybe early 60s. The set, which is basically the main set, which is like the Hitler's living room. It looks a little bit like I Love Lucy. It looks a little bit like Dick Van Dyke, the Dick Van Dyke Show. I mean, they capture the feel of it. There's a studio audience, but it's obviously used with a laugh track. You're looking at this thing and thinking, well, this is pretty misguided, but these are clearly talented people working on this. So that's always a fascination. I think talented people make something that misfires in such a spectacular way as this does.
Bruce, who are some of the talented people?
Well, the guy who created the show is a British writer. It's a British show. His name was Jeff Atkinson. He was like kind of a long-time comedy writer in Britain. I think his credits that would be most familiar here are Spitting Image, the satirical puppet show from the late 80s and 90s. So Jeff Atkinson, the creator of the show, had an excellent pedigree doing political comedy and satirical comedy in Britain. The producer of the show is a guy named Paul Jackson. All these people are still around. The show aired in 1990, but most of the cast and creative staff are still with us. Paul Jackson, the main producer, is also like a big figure in British comedy. Most of his shows might not be familiar to American audiences, but he had some of his big credits are The Young Ones, The Two Ronnies, Three of a Kind. He was also at various points the head of programming at the BBC and ITV. So he's a big deal. Jeff Atkinson referred to him as kind of the godfather of British alt comedy, which seems right. So maybe imagine him as like a little bit Lorne Michaels, a little bit Brandon Tartikoff, say, something along those lines. The sort of four central cast members all had good British comedy pedigrees.
Bruce, the idea of making a comedy around the Hitlers is unthinkable today. Why was it okay in the 1990s?
Well, it wasn't entirely okay in the 1990s either. Speaking to Jeff Atkinson, who I spoke to, and also Paul Jackson, I mean, the idea was he was trying to do a satire both of kind of authoritarianism and also people who enable authoritarianism. I think as the show went on, they sort of discarded this, but in his mind, it was very important that the show was set in 1938, before the war. The first episode is kind of a spin on the classic sitcom trope where somebody important is coming to dinner and Hitler and Ava want to impress him. And the person who's coming to dinner is Neville Chamberlain. So in Jeff Atkinson's mind, this was a satire of appeasement. In some ways, maybe it would be more interesting to do this sitcom now. They're doing it in 1990 as the Soviet Union is falling apart and people are talking about the end of history. Now, I think authoritarianism and nationalism are obviously much bigger problems. So in some ways, maybe doing the show now, the satiric intent might be a little clearer. I mean, I'm big emphasis on the word might, but the show did cause a lot of controversy at the time, both in Britain. A lot of the British Jewish organizations spoke out against it. There was a lot of controversy about it here in America. The show never aired here. It was only aired on a fledgling British satellite network, but people in America got wind of it and there was a lot written about it and a lot of critical commentary by people who hadn't seen the show. Newsweek did a big story about it. The LA Times did a big story about it. Liz Smith wrote about it in her column, said amusingly, I don't have the quote exactly right, but said something like, well, this is why Americans keep feeling culturally inferior to the British. I don't know. That was her response to the show. So yeah, I mean, it's funny. People didn't think it was okay to do it then too. I mean, part of the reason it got made in the first place was because the fledgling British satellite network I mentioned, which was called British Satellite Broadcasting, had just started airing in April of 1990. The Heil Honey, I'm Home pilot premiered in end of September 1990. The rest of the episodes were slated to be broadcast in January of 1991. But yeah, BSB was just looking to get attention. They were looking to kind of cause outrage. I mean, that was partly the hope.
I mean, on one hand, it also doesn't seem that crazy to do something around Hitler. We had Mel Brooks doing the producers. Later, obviously, we had Jojo Rabbit, which featured a comic turn by Hitler, quote unquote. Do you think, was it a failure of execution, a failure of having someone like a Mel Brooks sort of overseeing this thing that can bring the right touch to it? Would it have succeeded, or was it just the wrong thing at the wrong time and not executed so well?
I think the answer is all of the above. I mean, interestingly, there was an American writer who was involved with the show as well, who I spoke to. His name is Paul Dames, and he said something to the effect that you needed a genius to pull this off. You needed a Mel Brooks, you needed a Charlie Chaplin, who obviously did The Great Dictator, and that the people who were doing the show weren't geniuses. I think that's probably true. He also pointed out, interestingly, that it's one thing to satirize Hitler in a movie. It's another thing to satirize Hitler in a sitcom where he's the central character. And that implies like a certain affection for him. And certainly it does in the sense that it's a series. You're asking people to come back week after week. You're actually asking people to invest in Hitler as a character in a way that Jojo Rabbit doesn't and the producers don't. And even The Great Dictator didn't. It's like sort of traditionally sitcom or any TV show is somebody you want to have in your living room week after week. And do you really want Hitler in your living room?
Well, Bruce, I haven't seen this original episode on YouTube, but I think it's pretty safe to say that your oral history of Heil Honey, I'm Home is probably more enjoyable than the show itself. Just a guess.
That is not for me to say.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Always love talking to you.
Okay, likewise.
Well, Michael, of all of the corners of the internet that have inspired both fascination and disdain, there's nothing quite like Vogue Weddings, the arm of Vogue magazine that's dedicated to all things wedding, love, and nuptials, and as well as the Instagram account Vogue Weddings that chronicle the nuptials of the rich, famous, notorious, and occasionally criminal. Who knows? Maybe. But we have found a very interesting phenomenon, which two of our associate editors here are calling the curse of the Vogue wedding. It turns out that some of these marriages are doomed to failure, and we're trying to figure out why. So Paulina Prosnitz and Carolina de Armas, who are two associate editors for Airmail, are here to explain exactly what's going on and how we should interpret this phenomenon. Welcome, Paulina and Carolina.
Thank you for having us.
So maybe it's not fair to call it the Vogue curse, but we're going to do it anyway. What is the Vogue curse?
So the curse of the Vogue wedding, as we've been calling it, is that all of these couples are having these extravagant, glamorous, and absolutely beautiful weddings. But for one reason or another, we have found that a surprising amount of these marriages don't last very long. Many of them ending within a year or two of the wedding, or even under that year.
Okay, Paulina, but how many are we talking about here? How many weddings, let's just say in the past few years, like what has your research shown you?
So in our reporting, we found 30 since 2015. And this is just sort of a cursory search too. So I'm sure there are more, but we found 30 in our initial search.
So these are 30 couples since 2015 who have been featured in Vogue and broken up. And how many weddings are even featured in Vogue to begin with? I mean, that seems like a pretty high percentage right off the bat.
We found that Vogue Weddings specifically is covered in their digital site. So there are around 50 weddings covered per year. So yeah, just in 2022, there were 5 separations, divorces.
Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez certainly being the most recent one. Give us the most glaring examples of the Vogue wedding curse.
Yeah, other than Jennifer Lopez and Ben Affleck, who, of course, their whole divorce recently blew up and is everywhere. Another example that we found was Ariana Grande and Dalton Gomez, who were featured in Vogue in 2021. And by 2023, they were divorced. There was a big settlement, and Ariana Grande has moved on since. And another example is Sophia Bush and Grant Hughes. Sophia Bush from One Tree Hill fame, obviously. Their marriage lasted only 13 months after their initial wedding. And of course, has since ensued into some drama because Sophia Bush is now with Ashlyn Harris, who is a U.S. soccer player. And so there's been some scandal around that. But yeah, those are a couple big names.
And obviously, I feel like a lot of feedback that we got from our research was that celebrities always get divorced. So maybe it's not just the Vogue curse, but we also found that obviously Vogue covers a lot of weddings of socialites and just well-known couples overall. And so a few of those big names that we started off with Grace Morden and Matthew Buttman. Their marriage lasted sort of less than a year, and they just had this beautiful Jamaica wedding, and all sorts of like famous people were obviously there. And just other names in there are Natalie Salmon and Richard Setterwall, who got married in Portugal, and this other wedding, Alice Delahunt and Reese Lasher. They got married in a beautiful Irish castle in Ashford Castle.
Is there something to be extrapolated from the fact that these are all people who are not only willing to have their table settings deconstructed in the pages of Vogue, but who also kind of get excited by the idea? Because a lot of people would shun this kind of, celebrification and glorification of something that's supposed to be a meaningful family, personal event.
I think that's a good point, Ashley. I think people who do this sort of see the Vogue wedding feature as this badge of honor, and a lot of the preparation that goes into it, like the perfect tablescape, the perfect chef, the perfect candid photograph, all of this is done with them keeping in mind that all of this is going into Vogue. This is going into like one of the most popular fashion publications that all of their friends and all of their circles will see. And that's a lot of stress on them, first of all, as a couple, but it also is a sort of type of person that wants all of that to be on display and wants all that to be perfect. So there is an element of, are they overcompensating for something within their relationship? Is all of this attention on the superficial and having this perfect exterior sort of despising a lack within the relationship?
I think it's also worth noting that while they do make these events very public, Vogue interviews all of these brides. And while they are very excited to feature, their beautiful tablescapes and, sort of mention all of their couture dresses and just, the A-list guest list, they do all seem, at least on the page, very, very much in love and very excited for their big day. Just like, I would expect any bride to be. And we included in the chart some of the quotes that people, said. And some of these people really thought that this was a marriage to last forever and ever. And I think that is also something worth noting and something that, kind of is a reason why maybe people should heed the curse of the Vogue wedding.
There's also like an element of tempting fate here, right? Like, I always find that people, this is just a gross speculation, but I always find that people who are, showing off, French kissing on Instagram and showing off like their loving marriage or their hot sex life or whatever it happens to be on social media or in the pages of the magazine or on television, whatever it is, it always draws a bit of suspicion, no? You always sort of wonder, like, why do they feel the need to be so public about this? Is there something that they're trying to obscure or compensate for?
Again, we were just talking recently about the latest Vogue wedding, which was published on September 1st of this well-known couple called El Chody and Jack Paul. They're definitely not divorced yet. It's only been a few days, but I definitely think that right there is an example of not being afraid to show everything and anything in Vogue, so much so that she's basically naked in a picture of her Vogue wedding. And I feel that there's definitely a specific kind of person that wants to be featured in Vogue. And yes, those are very much public personas, which is another reason why when we were conducting all this research for who got divorced and who didn't, especially on the socialites and people who weren't celebrities, it was sort of easy for us to find out whether or not they were divorced because we could very much easily look into their lives on Instagram, them being, like I said, public personas.
Ladies, I have a question here from the guy in the room. So, there's an old saying, happy wife, happy life, but you've also been to weddings and sometimes you can see people up at the altar or wherever and you're like, they're not going to make it, or I think they'll make it, right? But clearly, I would imagine 98% of these Vogue weddings are the woman driving this thing, right? When you look at these and you've looked across your research, do you see this guy is just never going to stand for this? In other words, it's not quite a bridezilla, but as Ashley said, a woman who wants a lot of attention, and maybe this guy sure, I'm in for the ride for this, and all of a sudden we can see the seeds of the destruction there, and this guy's going to jump out. Can you see that coming?
I think the biggest indicator when we were researching of whether a couple was going to last or not was the couples were predominantly the women being fashion editors, celebrities, socialites, heiresses, and a lot of times their husband or fiance was a venture capital, executive or business person that was not at all affiliated with the world of fashion and Vogue and all of that. And a lot of times in those cases, those were the marriages that didn't work out.
And so what does that mean? The guy's I have no time for this.
Well, I think, like I mentioned before, these Vogue features obviously interview the bride. I think it is interesting to note that I almost never read a quote from the groom or the groom's thoughts.
I'd love to know what you guys found in your reporting about the editing process of these weddings, because it seems like it's a very specific type of person who's chosen to be featured in the pages of Vogue, right? And who is that person, or who are those people?
They're generally people who are interested in fashion. I think the articles really like to highlight the dresses that they're wearing, the process of the fitting, whether the bride has some sort of connection to Chanel. In the Grace Morton wedding, she had a connection to the design of the Chanel dress she was wearing. It was inspired by an old Karl Lagerfeld design. And there was a whole story that she had about that. And her godmother is Claudia Schiffer, and Claudia Schiffer had originally worn that dress. So they're really drawn to stories of the bride having some kind of personal connection with the fashion that they're wearing and a visible interest in fashion. And of course, it doesn't hurt if there's a couple A-lister connections, Claudia Schiffer.
So in other words, it's not, do you love each other? It's who are you wearing?
Exactly.
Ouch, Michael. Touche. Do we feel like that approach to the coverage has made the Vogue wedding less of a get, less interesting as a reader? To put it in a different way, does anyone really still care about the brides and grooms featured in Vogue, or is it just something you sort of love to hate looking at?
Love hate is a perfect word for a Vogue wedding. It's definitely something that we love looking at, but hate every single detail about. I think that when a Vogue wedding is published, everyone immediately, and by everyone, I mean every single girl my age, which is a 20-something girl based in New York, we just flock to the Instagram page and look at, the captions and like the engraved napkins and who was a surprise musical guest, and then examine the details of the dress. So I think that Vogue Weddings definitely has an audience. However, I do think that that audience is in itself very critical, sort of in, I guess, what we're doing.
Well, ladies, thank you so much for this fascinating story and incredible analysis. And we want you all to live happily ever after.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. Airmail's Arts Intel Report, our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it, is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, an Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
I know you have something you can recommend to us.
I do. It's the weekend, and it's the week we've all been waiting for. Dun, dun, dun. Why, Ashley? It's the return of one of yours and my favorite shows, Slow Horses.
There is
That's
a God.
Right. Season 4 of this fantastic London-based thriller series is here, and if you haven't watched it yet, I envy you, but I also urge you to start with Season 1 and give yourself a treat this fall as you discover the magnificence of Gary Oldman, Kristen Scott Thomas, Jonathan Pryce, and Jack Lowden leading the cast. And I'm not going to give too many details this week, Ashley, and maybe I thought to avoid spoilers, and maybe you and I can circle back in the coming weeks to discuss it all. But all I will say for now is run, don't walk to Slow Horses, and it's streaming now on Apple Plus TV. And you, my dear?
I'm reading a really bizarre novel. It's called Headshot by Rita Bullwinkle. Have you heard about it at all?
Have not at all.
It was long listed for the Booker, and it came out in March, but I think it's having a bit of a moment now. I think a lot of people are reading it this summer, but it's the story of 8 teenage girls who are champion boxers in the U.S., and it's told over a 2-day tournament. And it's a really interesting look at the physicality of this particular sport, but also of the physicality of being a teenage girl. And the question is really like, what is intimacy? What does it look like? And what does it mean? It's obviously, intriguing to people who care absolutely nothing about boxing or the world of sport, but it's just a really beautifully written, interesting novel. It's called Headshot by Rita Bullwinkle and published by Daunt Books and out now. And Michael, on that note, we thank you for joining us. Michael, will you please read us out?
Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Justin Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan. And our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We will be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting. But in the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music. But most of all, thanks again for joining us.